Hello everybody, my name's Ben Page. I'm the Chief Executive of Ipsos MORI. We're part of Ipsos, we're one of the world's largest research organisations, and I'm here today to talk about the future of work after the pandemic, because the dramatic events of the last year and a half have made many of us think that everything has changed. It's true that we've lived through a revolution in employment. Look at the number of people who are working at home in 2020 compared to the previous 5 years just in the UK. That's an astonishing shift. In many ways, the technology was ready for us to do this, but we had a taboo or a prejudice against doing it. People like me sometimes believe that people only really work properly when they're together in one place in a building. What last year has shown is that that taboo was probably completely wrong. Overall, it's had a big impact on work-life balance. While often people say that they've enjoyed not commuting, and indeed in Britain, the majority of people say they'll miss some aspects of lockdown, which on the face of it seems crazy. Often it's older workers often find that they didn't need as much face-to-face contact. They're more established in their careers. They know how to get things done. But it's young people, people in starting jobs, people in their 20s at the beginning of their careers who've often reported that they needed that face-to-face contact that they had before the pandemic, and they often want it afterwards. In terms of mental health, women have suffered more than men. So throughout the pandemic, we found, for example, that women have been more likely to say that they've got greater anxiety. They found it more difficult to stay positive. And of course, when you look at who's doing the work at home, particularly when schools are shut and children are being educated at home, what we found is that women all over the world are the people who carry the can. But overall, it's younger workers in particular who've had the greatest pressures. So we've got far more younger workers than older ones saying they've had to work increased hours. We've also got many more workers, younger workers than older ones, saying they've had to work decreased hours, perhaps because the business they are working in is going part-time or closing sometimes. And of course, leaving their job, 1 in 5 of the under 34s compared to only 11% of older people. We know that older people might take much longer to find a job if they lose it during the pandemic. And that's what happened after the crash of 2008. But overall, the burden does appear in our global studies to have fallen heavily on the young. And so we need to think about them as we think about how we rebuild. So we need to be very careful about saying that everything, the office is dead after the pandemic. It may well be that ultimately, once we are safe to go back together and spend lots of time in close proximity to each other, once vaccines are rolled out completely and the disease is conquered, hopefully, we will revert to our previous behaviours. The other thing to remember is that at least half the world can't work from home at all. There's a very small proportion of jobs actually that can be done totally remotely. So you can see that in India, there's only a fifth of the jobs that in Britain or America or Germany could be done at home. So it's a very, very mixed picture, but a lot of people, nearly 7, 8 out of 10 workers in many, many markets literally can't work at home even if they want to. So again, we must get a sense of perspective. I'm talking, from a sort of white-collar perspective very much when I talk about the death of offices. But of course, offices are not the only place where work takes place. Overall, however, McKinsey estimate that we could probably have a quarter of our workers now at home between either 3 days or even permanently 5 days a week, and we wouldn't lose any productivity. And certainly that is what workers want in the studies that we have been doing around the world. They want to spend between 3 to 5 days a week at home. Whether that's the best thing for the business is not clear, but that's what workers want. And in many cases, I think they will be offered it. What we can see is that before the pandemic, we were not, although the world had been urbanizing, we were piling into cities like ants all over the world. Actually, in Europe, only a minority of people said they actually would prefer to live in big cities. In my country, in Britain, it was a quarter, very similar in Germany, in Belgium, in France, in Italy. And it's only really in the developing world where people can see communities being lifted out of poverty by urbanization and growth, in India, in China, in South Korea, in Indonesia, that people still wanted to live in cities, even before the pandemic. So the pandemic does give people the opportunity to live a more distributed life, to live 100 or 200 miles away from the office, somewhere much cheaper, and maybe only go in once or twice a week. And certainly for many Europeans, that looks like something that would appeal. Whether their bosses will let them is another matter. So, I think leaders have a real responsibility now to think quite hard about how they take their people with them. What we saw in business as we saw in politics during the pandemic, was that business leadership saw the same type of rally round the flag effect that we saw political leaders like Angela Merkel in Germany or Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand enjoy during the pandemic. So people looked up to the management of business to step up and be counted. And what we found in our studies around the world is that overall people believe business did a good job in responding to the pandemic. People believe that business did a good job in listening to employees and being flexible. But we've now got these very different scenarios. So you can see Joe Garner, who leads one of the largest banks in Britain, the Nationwide Building Society, last year has taught us, many of us, about that how our jobs is much more important than where we do them. How we do them is much more important than where we do them. And in contrast, Goldman Sachs, read in tooth and claw, home working is an aberration we're going to correct as soon as possible. Everybody's going to be in an office. So now those may be two extremes, but to me they're just two sides of the same coin. So I think we don't know yet, but what it means is that we can certainly see signs of people spending at least 2 to 3 days a week at home in future. You can see Mondays and Fridays being pretty empty in offices. It means that we need to think hard about what tasks we need people together to be profitable and successful and effective in doing, and which tasks actually they will be more successful and effective at doing at home. I think the fact that our values don't change that fast means that the office is not dead. We like being with people. We miss the banter, that saying hello to people at the coffee machine. Even saying, I even miss saying hello to people at the bread store when I go and buy my bread every day. You know, it's a very different world. So I think the office is not dead, but it's likely to be different. We do need to consider the drivers for the future of work. So, you know, what actually works best. Perhaps we can now know what people actually want as opposed to what we might allow them to have. Which bits of everybody's job? Think about your own job. Which bits can you do best online? And which bits actually do you do better when you're sitting in real life physically with somebody? And I think we should all ask ourselves those questions. And finally, I think as we come out of this, a reminder that the world is not a homogeneous place. And if anything, the world will be an even more heterogeneous and diverse place as we come out. There is a real risk of a K-shaped recovery. The advanced economies bounce back. They've got high vaccination rates. We've already seen growth in America far ahead of where we expected it to be last year, partly because of Joe Biden's stimulus. They've got better tech. They're able to work remotely, etc. And therefore, that gap between those countries and those that have heavy, high-touch industries that need people together, have not got their vaccination programs working, are likely to get even bigger. And so if you're a global business looking across your portfolio and thinking with some sort of nuance about what's going to happen, will be even more important. Thank you so much for listening.